All right, hey everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about what is open source, and my name is Mateo Kidd. So first we're going to go over the agenda. The first thing that we'll talk about is what is open source, how does open source work, open source versus closed source software, principles of open source, history of open source, disadvantages of open source, and finally the conclusion and examples of open source. So the first slide is, what is open source? Open source is a code that is freely available to its users, and anyone else have the ability to take this source code, modify it, and distribute their own versions of the program. The users also have the ability to distribute as many copies of the original program as they want. Anyone can use this program for any purpose, and there are no licensing fees or any other restrictions on the software. So quickly, I made an example about it, and I'm going to tell you. So, for example, let's say I create an open source operating system called Tricky. Tricky, since it is open source, would allow you to install the program as many times as you want on as many computers as you can find. You can also create as many copies as you want and give them to friends, family, whoever you want. You can even sell them and make profit, and that is completely legal. You can also alter Tricky and put it into a disk and redistribute it. And the only reason that you are allowed to do this is because of the open source availability, and this would not be possible with a closed source technology. Since I've already brought up closed source, I might as well tell you about it really quickly. Closed source software is simply a program or software that has a license which limits other people outside of the program or company from touching the source code. Just to clarify, open source software is a source code that is under a license. Copyright holders grant users the right to change and distribute software to anyone for any reason. Open source is also seen as a public initiative that requires open collaboration in the public. This open source movement creates a culture with products and designs that no other company has thought of before. And this type of collaboration would be impossible for one company to sustain with the amount of work and design that is taking place. The next thing on the agenda I'll get into is, how does open source work? So I have a little diagram here that kind of explains it, but I'm also going to explain it to you, obviously, right now. How does open source operate and work in society? So to begin, a developer creates a code or a program. This program has source code, which is open to the public. This program is then used and seen by users, developers, which then mess around with the code and mess around with the program. After using the program, these users and developers begin to improve the source code by using patches, which better the program for their personal needs, and also leads to better code for the program. And then that inevitably leads to vastly improved code for society, which can save a lot of money and time for people and companies. Next, I'm going to get into open source versus closed source software. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is price policy. Open source is often referred to as a free cost software. It can, however, have costs for extras like assistance, additional services, or added functionality. Thus, you may still pay for a service with open source, but closed source software is usually a paid software that costs can vary depending on the complexity of the software and how much you're willing to pay. While the price can be higher, what you get is a better product that is more suitable for like just a regular person trying to use a program rather than a developer. You also get full support from a team. You get functionality and innovation. However, most companies provide free trials to convince the purchaser that their software is the right fit, especially in in closed source software instead of an open source, which is kind of people messing around, trying to figure out what they want to do with certain codes and what fits them more suitably. The next thing I'm going to talk about is security. The question of security is very controversial for open source and closed source software. Each software has two sides to the security problem. The code of open source software can be viewed, shared, and modified by the community, which means anyone can fix, upgrade, and test the broken code. The bugs are fixed quickly, and the code is checked thoroughly after each release. That's because there's so many people looking at it and so many patches taking place. However, because of availability, the source code is often can be, hacked by hackers, which can obviously take advantage of the program. On the other side, closed source software can be fixed only by the actual vendor that sold you the program, because they're the only ones allowed to access the code. If something goes wrong with the software, the user sends a request and waits for an answer from a support team. Solving the problem can take much longer compared to open source. When it comes to choosing the most secure software, the answer is that each of them has its pros and cons, and it kind of depends on what your level is regarding software and code. The next thing I'm going to talk about is quality of support. Comparing open source and closed source software, support is obvious that closed source software kind of has the better case in this aspect. The costs for it include an option to contact support teams and get feedback in one business day in most cases. The response is well organized and documented. For open source software, such option is not provided since it's really more on you, the user. The only support option are forums, useful articles, but you can also hire experts to help you out, but they're also very pricey. It is not surprising that using such kind of service will not really get you a high level of response compared to closed source software. Next, I'm going to talk about source code availability. So open sources software provide an ability to change the source code without any restrictions, do whatever you want, patch up whatever you'd like. Individual users can develop what they want and get benefits from innovation developed by others within their community. As the source code is easily accessible, it enables the software developers to improve the already existing programs, while closed source software is more restricted than open source software because the source code cannot be changed or viewed by anybody outside of the company or program. However, such limitations is what may contribute to closed source software, the reliability and their security, which will obviously can only be altered by that one program or company that deals with that software. The next slide I have is the usability. Usability is kind of a hard subject for open source software. User guides are written for developers rather than just the average person that is trying to use the internet or the program or the code. Also, these manuals are failing to conform to the standards and structures of the society. For closed source software, usability is one of the merits. Documentation is usually very well written and contains detailed instructions that can help the average person really work the software, since you can't even see the code. Okay, so next on the agenda, we're going to talk about the principles of open source. I have 3 principles on my slide: source code, free redistribution, and licenses cannot be specific to a product. So first, I'll talk about source code. Source code must allow distribution in source code as well as compiled form. Where some of a product is not distributed with source code, there must be well-publicized means of obtaining the source code for no more than a reasonable reproduction cost. Preferably downloading via the internet without charge. The source code must be the preferred form with which a programmer would modify the program. Delivery intermediate forms such as the output of a preprocessor or translator are not allowed. Then we're going to get into free redistribution. The license will not restrict any party from selling or giving away the software as a component of an aggregate software distribution containing programs from several different sources. The license shall not require a royalty or other fees for such sale. That's pretty easy. Open source for your distribution. Then license must not be specific to a product. The rights attached to a program must not depend on the program's being part of a particular software distribution. The program is extracted from that distribution and used or distributed within the terms of the program's license. All parties to whom the program is redistributed should have the same rights as those who are granted the original software distribution. Then I have some more principles on the next slide. The integrity of the author's source code, and then the license must not restrict other software. The license may not restrict source code from being distributed in modified form only. The license allows the distribution of patch files with the source code for the purpose of modifying the program at build time. The license must explicitly permit distribution of the software built from modified source code. The license may be required derived works to carry a different name or version number of the original code. So it has to be different than the original one. License must not restrict other software. The license must not place restrictions on other software that is distributed along with the licensed software. For example, the license must not insist that all other programs distributed on the same medium must be open source software. So that's just a few principles of open source. It's a little, just a little, kind of boring, but just things that you need to know about it. Then we're going to get into the history of open source. In 1977, Eric Raymond, a free software advocate, penned The Cathedral and the Bazaar, comparing the development styles of the GNU project and the Linux project before they were combined. The Cathedral project states that source code is made by a small group of developers distributed freely with each software release, while the Bazaar source code is developed over the internet in public spaces. So the concept of free sharing of technologies information existed long before computers. Similar to open standards, researchers with access to advanced research projects used a process called request for comments to develop telecommunication network protocols, which led to the birth of the internet in 1969. Term open source was adopted by a group of people held at Palo Alto, California. The Open Source Summit, organized in April 1998 by technology publisher Tim O'Reilly. So that's just a really brief history, and then we're going to move on to the disadvantages. So some disadvantages of open source are that open source software is not very straightforward to use. Open source operating systems like Linux cannot be learned in a day. They require effort and possibly training from your side before you are able to master them. You may need to hire a trained person to make this easier, but this will incur additional costs. So it's not entirely free if you really, really want to learn it, actually. There's a shortage of applications that run both on open source and proprietary software. Therefore, switching to an open source platform involves compatibility analysis of all other software used that run on proprietary platforms. In addition, there are many ongoing parallel developments on open source software. This creates confusion on different versions of open source software. Lastly, many of the latest hardwares are incompatible with like the current open source platforms that are out there today. So you kind of have to reach out and find somebody else that has that platform so that then that you can get it. So then we're going to move into some examples of open source. Obviously, we all know what Firefox is, OpenOffice.org, Moodle, Mailman, GNOME, and Apache HTTP server. Apache is really famous, and if you want to look it up, you can just look it up on the internet and you'll get their website, and it tells you a lot about what is going on. And in conclusion, since the invention of the open source software and free software existed, however, what sets free and open source software apart is that the user can see and modify the program code, giving users opportunity to use, learn, distribute, and sometimes make profit by selling that software. Just because open source software is free doesn't mean it's the better option than paid software by any means, and sometimes it's better in terms of community support and security. Though one source software is free and gives users many benefits, ironically, it comes with the cost of software industry itself. Open source software takes away profit from the software industry. In many cases, open source software relies on help from the community and from its users, which sometimes isn't very reliable, which kind of stinks. But all open source software is supported or maintained since distributors of the software can modify the code. Users of the software may be fooled into using software that actually contains virus, spyware, and other privacy and security concerns, which we talked about earlier in the presentation. And while open source software is the free source of computer software, the development of the community is a wealth of resource. It does have a negative side of the harming the software industry, but the open source software has its advantages and disadvantages, but the benefits are far more superior than the disadvantages. By ignoring the harms, open source software is truly today's revolution in this aspect. Today's generation of programmers and anyone involving themselves in IT should try to contribute to the open source community by participating in development of open source software. Here's two of my source pages, and I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you got a little bit more knowledge, and thanks for watching.